Starting a new book by Alfred Bester, The Star's My Destination. Masterworks presents The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. Copyright 1956. To Truman M. Talley. There is an introduction by Graham Slate. We will skip, no spoilers. Part 1. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Blake. Prologue. This was a golden age, a time of high adventure, rich living, and hard dying. But nobody thought so. This was a future of fortune and theft, pillage and rapine, culture and vice. But nobody admitted it. This was an age of extremes, a fascinating century of freaks, but nobody loved it. All the habitable worlds of the solar system were occupied. 3 planets and 8 satellites and 11 million people swarmed in one of the most exciting ages ever known. Yet minds still yearn for other times, as always. The solar system seethed with activity, fighting, feeding, and breeding, learning the new technologies that spewed forth almost before the old had been mastered, girding itself for the first exploration of the far stars in deep space. But where are the new frontiers? The Romantics cried, unaware that the frontier of the mind had opened in a laboratory on Callisto at the turn of the 24th century. A researcher named Jaunt set fire to his bench and himself, accidentally, and let out a yell for help with particular reference to a fire extinguisher. Who so surprised as Jaunt and his colleagues when he found himself standing alongside said extinguisher, 70 feet removed from his lab bench. They put Jaunt out and went into the whys and wherefores of his instantaneous 70-foot journey. Teleportation. Teleportation, the transportation of oneself through space by an effort of the mind alone, had long been a theoretic concept, and there were a few hundred badly documented proofs that it had happened in the past. This was the first time that it had ever taken place before professional observers. They investigated the Jaunt effect savagely. This was something too earth-shaking to handle with kid gloves, and Jaunt was anxious to make his name immortal. He had his will and said farewell to his friends. Jaunt knew he was going to die because his fellow researchers were determined to kill him, if necessary. There was no doubt about that. 12 psychologists, parapsychologists, and neurometrists of varying specializations were called in as observers. The experimenters sealed Jaunt into an unbreakable crystal tank. They opened a water valve, feeding water into the tank, and let Jaunt watch them smash the valve handle. It was impossible to open the tank. It was impossible to stop the flow of water. The theory was that if it had required the threat of death to goad Jaunt into teleporting himself in the first place, they'd damned well threaten him with death again. The tank filled quickly. The observers collected data with the tense precision of an eclipse camera crew. Jaunt began to drown. Then he was outside the tank, dripping and coughing explosively. He teleported again. The experts examined and questioned him. They studied graphs and x-rays, neural patterns, and body chemistry. They began to get an inkling of how Jaunt had teleported. On the technical grapevine, this had to be kept secret, they sent out a call for suicide volunteers. They were still in the primitive stage of teleportation. Death was the only spur they knew. They briefed the volunteers thoroughly. Jaunt lectured on what he had done and how he thought he had done it. Then they proceeded to murder the volunteers. They drowned them, hanged them, burned them. They invented new forms of slow and controlled death. There was never any doubt in any of the subjects that death was the object. 80% of the volunteers died, and the agonies and remorse of the murderers would make a fascinating and horrible study, but that was no place in this history except to highlight the monstrosity of the times. 80% of the volunteers died, but 20% jaunted. The name became a word almost immediately. Bring back the Romantic Age, the Romantics pleaded, when men could risk their lives in high adventure. The body of knowledge grew rapidly. By the first decade of the 25th century, the principles of jaunting were established, and the first school was opened by Charles Fort Jaunt himself. then 57, immortalized, and ashamed to admit that he had never dared jaunt again. But the primitive days were past. It was no longer necessary to threaten a man with death to make him teleport. They had learned how to teach man to recognize, discipline, and exploit yet another resource of his limitless mind. How exactly did man teleport? One of the most unsatisfactory explanations was provided by Spencer Thompson, publicity representative of the Jaunt schools, in a press interview. This is Thompson. Jaunting is like seeing. It is a natural aptitude of almost every human organism, but it can only be developed by training and experience. Reporter. You mean we couldn't see without practice? Obviously, you're either unmarried or have no children. Preferably both. I don't understand. Anyone who's observed an infant learning to use its eyes would. But what is teleportation? The transportation of oneself from one locality to another by the effort of the mind alone. You mean we can think ourselves from, say, New York to Chicago? Precisely. Would we arrive naked? If you started naked. I mean, would our clothes teleport with us? When people teleport, they also teleport the clothes they wear and whatever they are strong enough to carry. I hate to disappoint you, but even ladies' clothes would arrive with them. But how do we do it? How do you think? With our minds. And how does the mind think? What is the thinking process? Exactly how do we remember, imagine, deduce, create? Exactly how do the brain cells operate? I don't know. Nobody knows. And nobody knows exactly how we teleport either. But we know we can do it, just as we know that we can think. Have you ever heard of Descartes? He said, Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. We say, Cogito ergo hanteo. I think, therefore I jaunt. If it is thought that Thomson's explanation is exasperating, inspect this report of Sir John Kelvin of the Royal Society on the mechanisms of jaunting. We have established that the teleportive ability is associated with the Nissl bodies of tigroid substance in nerve cells. The tigroid substance is easiest demonstrated by Nissl's method using 3.75 g of methylene blue and 1.75 g of Venetian soap dissolved in 1 kcc of water. Where the tigroid substance does not appear, jaunting is impossible. Teleportation is a tigroid function. Any man was capable of jaunting, provided he developed two faculties, visualization and concentration. He had to visualize, completely and precisely, the spot to which he desired to teleport himself, and he had to concentrate the latent energy of his mind into a single thrust to get him there. Above all, he had to have faith, the faith that Charles Fort Jaunt never recovered. He had to believe he could jaunt. The slightest doubt would block the mind thrust necessary for teleportation. The limitations with which every man is born necessarily limited the ability to jaunt. Some could visualize magnificently and set the coordinates of their destination with precision, but lacked the power to get there. Others had the power, but could not, so to speak, see where they were jaunting. And space set a final limitation, for no man had ever jaunted further than 1,000 miles. He could work his way in jaunting jumps over land and water from Nome to Mexico, but no jump could exceed 1,000 miles. By the 2420s, this form of employment application blank had become a commonplace. This space reserved for retina pattern identification. Name, put your last first middle name here, residence, continent, country, county, jaunt class, official rating, check 1 only. So there's M class is 1,000, D 500, C 100, L, XV 5, 10, 50, 10, 5 respectively. The old Bureau of Motor Vehicles took over the new job and regularly tested and classified jaunt applicants, and the old American Automobile Association changed its initials to AJA. Despite all efforts, no man had ever jaunted across the voids of space, although many experts and fools had tried. Helmut Grant, for one, who spent a month memorizing the coordinates of a jaunt stage on the moon and visualized every mile of the 240,000-mile trajectory from Times Square to Kepler City. Grant jaunted and disappeared. They never found him. They never found Enzio Dadridge, a Los Angeles revivalist looking for heaven. Jacob Maria Friendlich, a paraphysicist who should have known better than to jaunt into deep space searching for metadimensions. Shipwreck Kogan, a professional seeker after notoriety, and hundreds of others, lunatic fringers, neurotics, escapists, and suicides. Space was closed to teleportation. Jaunting was restricted to the surfaces of the planets of the solar system. But within 3 generations, the entire solar system was on the jaunt. The transition was more spectacular than the changeover from horse and buggy to gasoline age 5 centuries before. On 3 planets and 8 satellites, social, legal, and economic structures crashed, while the new customs and laws demanded by universal jaunting mushroomed in their place. There were land riots as the jaunting poor deserted slums to squat in plains and forests, raiding the livestock and wildlife. There was a revolution in home and office building. Labyrinths and masking devices had to be introduced to prevent unlawful entry by jaunting. There were crashes and panics and strikes and famines as pre-jaunt industries failed. Plagues and pandemics raged as jaunting vagrants carried disease and vermin into defenseless countries. Malaria, elephantiasis, and the breakbone fever came north to Greenland. Rabies returned to England after an absence of 300 years. The Japanese beetle, the citrus scale, the chestnut blight, and the elm borer spread to every corner of the world, and from one forgotten pest hole in Borneo, leprosy, long imagined extinct, reappeared. Crime waves swept the planets, and satellites as their underworlds took to jaunting with the night around the clock, and there were brutalities as the police fought them without quarter. There came a hideous return to the worst prudency of Victorianism, as society fought the sexual and moral dangers of jaunting with protocol and taboo. A cruel and vicious war broke out between the inner planets, Venus, Terra, and Mars, and the outer satellites. A war brought on by the economic and political pressures of teleportation. Until the jaunt age dawned, the 3 inner planets and the moon had lived in delicate economic balance with the 7 inhabited outer satellites, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto of Jupiter, Rhea and Titan of Saturn, and Lassell of Neptune. The united outer satellites supplied raw materials for the inner planets' manufactories and a market for their finished goods. Within a decade, this balance was destroyed by jaunting. The outer satellites, raw young worlds in the making, had bought 70% of the IP transportation production. Jaunting ended that. They had bought 90% of the IP communications production. Jaunting ended that too. In consequence, IP purchase of OS raw materials fell off. With trade exchange destroyed, it was inevitable that the economic war would degenerate into a shooting war. Inner planets' cartels refused to ship manufacturing equipment to the outer satellites, attempting to protect themselves against competition. The OS confiscated the plants already in operation on their worlds, broke patent agreements, ignored royalty obligations, and the war was on. It was an age of freaks, monsters, and grotesques. All the world was mishappen in marvelous and malevolent ways. The classicists and romantics who hated it were unaware of the potential greatness of the 25th century. They were blind to a cold fact of evolution, that progress stems from the clashing merger of antagonistic extremes, out of the marriage of pinnacle freaks. Classicists and romantics alike were unaware that the solar system was trembling on the verge of a human explosion that would transform man and make him the master of the universe. It is against this seething background of the 25th century that the vengeful history of Gulliver Foyle begins.